Welcome back to the Oscar Project Podcast, a show where I discuss Oscar-nominated films year by year. I am your host, Jonathan Eaterberg, and today I'm bringing you an interview with Paul Kowalski, director of the short film Sardinia. Before I jump into the interview, please be sure to subscribe to the show in your podcast player so you can get all the newest episodes as soon as they are released. If you like the interview and want to hear more, please consider leaving a rating and review in Apple Podcasts or Spotify. Paul Kowalski is a writer and director whose debut feature, Paper Tiger, won the Audience Award and a jury mention at the 2020 Austin Film Festival. His other films have won recognition from the ASC, Beijing Film Academy, Canadian Cinematograph, Aesthetica, and Raindance Festivals, among others. Born in England to Polish immigrants, Paul studied at Brown University and the American Film Institute Conservatory. His films often center around identity, exile, and obsession, and he joins me on the podcast to talk about his latest short film, Sardinia. Paul, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much, Jonathan. Thanks for having me.
So I was so intrigued by your story, especially how the opening few shots seemingly have little to do with the rest of the film when you think back to them from the beginning. What was the inspiration behind this story?
So essentially, the film's about a deadly plague that spreads through laughter. So there were a couple of things that sort of spawned the idea. I think of someone like Lars von Trier, who says that a good film is like a rock stuck in your shoe, it just kind of won't go away. So the initial thing for me happened many years ago. I was just in a subway, and someone reading a book started giggling, and the laughter just spread through the carriage very strangely and surreally and organically. And it kind of just stayed in the back of my brain as something that, is such an interesting human thing that we do, laughter. I mean, it kind of predates humor. It's a coping mechanism. It could be derisive. It could be soothing. It's inappropriate. It's just such an interesting sort of human phenomenon, So that stayed in my head, that whole incident. And then I think the next thing that kind of clicked was obviously the pandemic. There's obviously inspiration from what we all went through. 5, 6, 7 billion, however many people there are on the earth, went through collectively. And then those two ideas kind of fused, and I started thinking, well, what if instead of COVID-19, it was, my virus, which is called SARD-23, and instead of spreading through coughing and was a virus of that nature, it was spread through laughter. That was the first kind of genesis, those two ideas sort of banging into each other. And then I started researching, and of course, truth is stranger than fiction, because this actually happened in several places in the earth.
Oh, why?
In 1962, in Tanganyika, what was then called Tanganyika, there was a laughter epidemic that started with 2 schoolgirls that spread throughout a whole village, then half the country. I mean, I don't think people died, but it was certainly a psychogenic illness that spread. And then, of course, you had this dancing tarantism in Belgium, I believe, in the 16th century. And there's something called gelastic seizures that are seizures that kind of make you look like you're laughing. There's this pseudobulbar effect. There's even a virus that spreads through cannibalism called kuru, which kind of has that kind of effect. So, I started researching, I went down a rabbit hole, and then I started thinking about the word sardonic, and that's what kind of spawned the film's title. Sardinia is actually so named after this plant that was native there called the sardonion, which is where we get the name, the word sardonic, which actually Homer coined in the Odyssey. So it's this crazy sort of layered metaphor that I ran with. And, I also wanted it to be emotional. So hence the protagonist, Ryszard Przybyszewski. I'm Polish, so I chose the most difficult Polish name to add to the humor, and something that people in my family go through, in the West, having difficult names with few consonants. But, basically at the heart of it, I wanted to get into touch with those feelings of isolation and being removed from society, and also the crazy polarization. I mean, it's such a trademark of what's happening everywhere in the world today, politically and socially, in every country, bar none. But I think there's something about the pandemic which really kind of maybe not kickstarted that, but is indicative of that. So then I started thinking, well, okay, if laughter is the thing that kills, how far can I take that dystopian society where being glum and sadness is almost promoted as a way to stay alive? I just thought it was a really interesting paradox. And for me, the best films are built on paradoxes. So once I had the Polish, American protagonist and the concept, I just kind of did as much as I could within 20 minutes in the budget I had to kind of tell this story.
Yeah. And you mentioned there, kind of diving into that world. I really like how you explore that, where it's a world where happiness, laughter are completely frowned upon. People are forced into, a medicated depression almost, as opposed to kind of our life where we do things completely the opposite. We're trying to find ways to find happiness. We're medicating to find happiness. What was like trying to pull on those threads and see how far you could take some of those things?
Yeah, I mean, I think the first thing I did was it was intellectual. You know, I thought about all the things that kind of marked COVID and the things we went through, and then I tried to flip them. So, you know, instead of vaccines and masks and social distancing, I thought like, you know, what if there are like sad tales read by a reader in trains on the tannoy, and if people, you know, gathered in graveyards so they stayed solemn instead of the alleged Wuhan bat, you know, I had a Sardinian cockatoo. And to go back to your first question, that's essentially the beginning of the film. It's the origin of the virus, which comes in a crate from Sardinia. So that, you know, it's an intellectual thing, but of course, I'm always looking for the emotional side, and also tonally. You know, I think I love your podcast because you bring in a lot of short film filmmakers, and it's such like a marginalized, sometimes often treated as an overly practical art form. You know, like hey, it's a means to an end, or it's a proof of concept or something. But it really it's tough to make a good short, especially in the time frame, you know, 10, 15, 20 minutes to tell a story. And also, one of the reasons I did, I mean, I made a feature a few years ago. So a lot of people are like, why are you making a short after a feature? But it you know, really gives you the opportunity to play around and try things that might be way riskier for a feature or take, you know, longer to get off the ground. So for me, the inspiration was also partially just to try to create a really unsettling, odd tone, kind of like early Polanski films like The Tenant, or Yorgos Lanthimos films like The Lobster, or a short film he made called Mimic that's fantastic. Just sort of like, you know, no commercial prospects of making money, just
Yeah.
how weirdly and precisely can I form a tone that will make people laugh and at the same time feel dread-ridden. So I think it's kind of like a you know, the pandemic or riffing off of that was a great starting point because of how we all felt during that, you know. So again, it's combining that metaphor with the emotion of the character and the feelings that are sort of universal. I think that was the key to unlocking the film.
Yeah, and you're mentioning, talking about making short films and the limited time frame that you have to tell a story in a short film. I think you do a really good job of covering what I think is at least a year's worth of time in your film in the course of about 20 minutes. Some really good editing and cutting to show the passage of time. What were some of the biggest challenges in distilling down that year's worth of events into the just 20-minute runtime?
So it's a really good question. I mean, I struggle with this. I'm sure a lot of people do. The scope of the world, my films tend to be quite big in terms of world building, right? So the first couple drafts were scenes on different parts of the earth of different people responding to the pandemic, and it was just huge, the scope. So the challenge was how can I tell this large story of a big world in the smallest possible way? And I settled on a couple of days before the pandemic sort of breaks, before anyone knows, you know, really what's going on. If you go back to the actual COVID-19 break, you might remember there was that moment where it's like, oh, something's arrived in Seattle, and you know, then it kind of spread like wildfire. So the kind of 2 or 3 days in that time period when something's happening at his office, at Richard's office, someone's laughing. The next day, someone dies. That person dies. Hearing stuff on the news. Then sort of his wife dies. And then he's in it. And then we cut, and then we're a year into the depths of the doldrums of the grimness of just, you know, been living with this for a year. It's awful. Again, I drew on those iconic images of, like, if you remember in Shanghai, for example, there are people yelling out of their skyscrapers, and in Italy as well, actually, or those images of people in you know, suits in cemeteries, you know, dropping their loved ones into graves because they didn't know how the virus was spreading. So the time scale really was 2 days before, and then 2 days in the worst part, and then kind of ends. I'm gonna give it away, but it ends with sort of a release of sorts. But that's the best I could settle on, and it still felt a tad cursory. But hopefully, you get a sense of a full story and something other than just like a proof of concept, which I suppose it could be a feature. But I wanted it to exist on its own, you know, and stand on its own merit
Yeah.
as a short.
Yeah, no, I think it definitely works in the time that you have. Now, you mentioned your protagonist, Richard. I hope I'm saying that as close to correct as possible. It's a really good actors throughout the entire film. How did you go about landing some of these great actors, from other fairly big name movies over their careers?
I mean, I think every director, good director, will tell you that casting is 90% of it, right? I mean, the percentage differs depending who you talk to, but if you know, and I think for something like this, it's not just casting good actors, it's casting with them in mind as if it's like a palette in a painting, right? So Philip, for me, I saw him in Paul Schrader's first Reformed. He had a fantastic, very long scene opposite Ethan Hawke where he plays an environmental terrorist. Fantastic. And I remember walking out of the theater with my wife thinking like, who is that guy? And then lo and behold, several years later, turns out my wife, who's also an actress, Sorel Carradine, her acting coach and Philip's are the same. So, when I started thinking about the role, I courted Philip. He was quite busy because a lot of these people, like you say, are doing other things. And then sort of the strikes happened and, people were a bit more free. And actually by SAG and AFTRA contracts, the only thing they could really do was shorts sort of legally with the unions, So that kind of helped worked in my favor a little bit. But, I think about Sidney Lumet said that you cast for the third act, which I really love. That advice always has stuck with me. The truth of the character, the final truth. So I'm always thinking about, a character's arc and how they're landing at the end, and then thinking if that person's got it. So someone like Oleg Krupa, he's a pretty well-known Polish actor and has done a lot of stuff in the States since the 80s. He's been in two Coen brothers films, Burn After Reading and Miller's Crossing, and he's based in New York. And I thought he'd be perfect for the dad because, I wanted a Polish-speaking person of a specific age, and there's not a lot of those, and he was
Sure.
my number one choice. But I'm like, how is this guy going to fly up to New York, from New York to LA for a day for virtually no pay? And it's interesting, it's worth shooting your shot because it turns out he was pretty fed up of playing Russian spies or a scientist or he's done so many of those.
Yeah.
And I think he connected with the character and it reminded him of his dad a little bit, which, is typical of Polish history, that sort of kind of like sad, exiled nature, which I was trying to tap into with Philip's dad's thread in this story, Grzegorz, who's in a retirement home and he's suffering from dementia. He actually thinks he's his own dad. So anyway, that's how I got Oleg. He just wanted to play the role. Martha Plimpton is fantastic. She's an Emmy winner. She's been in everything from The Goonies to Mass a couple of years ago, which won a bunch of awards. Brita Wool, who's super quirky and makes such interesting choices, plays Philip's wife in the film, Hillary. So I think each of them kind of gave a color, to the film that collectively contributed to this really weird tone that I was going for. It's not enough just to cast 4 fantastic actors, I think that's where the casting really comes in. And someone like Yorgos Lanthimos does that very well too. He makes very interesting choices with like in The Lobster and all these kind of films. So I think that's part of the success of those films. But all the way through, I mean, I cast this like a year before I shoot it, slowly thinking about people, and even the 3 actors in The Office, the sort of day players, fantastic. Jongman Kim, he's a Korean American. He was the first one to die in the film, and he has this very guttural laugh that I remember when he did. It was sort of like kind of funny, but very like dread-ridden, which is the exact tone we were going for. And even the sound guy, when he finished, he lifted up his headphones and was like, damn, So I think we all knew we had something.
Yeah.
It was like it coalesced around this weird moment. Goran Ivanovsky, who played another office worker, and Akende Munalula, sort of like the whole ensemble really served the piece and kind of understood what I was doing. But I really wanted to make sure everyone was playing everything grounded, because it's very easy for these kind of films to play for the laughs and then all of a sudden it just becomes silly and it becomes an SNL skit or something. And I think it was important to have everyone play absolutely truthfully, with objectives, with backstory, with intention and subtext. So I was blessed. It all worked out. I got everyone I wanted, and I'm very, very pleased with the cast.
And I want to circle back to your main character for a moment. I'm struck by how little emotion he has to show, but in doing that, it's probably even more difficult as an actor to show no emotion, no laughter, no be completely neutral almost throughout the entire thing. How important was it to get that exact portrayal of lack of emotion nailed down through him?
I think it's you sort of define good acting in a weird way. I think it's having a lot going on underneath. Ted Talley, who wrote Silence of the Lambs, used to say that what makes a great scene isn't the emotion they're playing, but what they're trying to conceal. So basically, I wrote a character where he's doing that the whole film. So I think hopefully what Philip responded to was that challenge. And in a weird way, like he needs to laugh more than anyone in the film. He needs to let go. He needs to have that catharsis. And I think the whole film, he's holding on to something through, his wife's death and everything else that happens in the film. I don't want to ruin it, but I think actually, ironically, what you've defined is what actors love, which is having a lot bubbling under the surface and restricting emotion.
Yeah.
So in that regard, it's a subtlety that I think that Richard as a character and then Philip connected with and really delivered on.
Yeah. Well, I have a couple of questions not specifically related to the film. Before I move on to those, is there anything else you want to touch on about Sardinia?
Just to watch it on Leto. It's on the YouTube channel on Leto. We had our online premiere after premiering last summer at IndieShorts, and then the film won grand prize best director at Flicker's Rhode Island. So we're very, very pleased with our run, and now it's online for the world to watch. So we'd love for you guys to check it out and comment and like and ask questions. And probably we're going to get to that at the end, but I thought I'd throw it in.
Fantastic. Yeah, we'll make sure to put a link in there so people can check it out.
Great.
Well, this might be the hardest question I ask, but if you had to pick your top 3 films of all time, what would they be?
My God. Okay, so there's some obvious choices. I can't just say 3, so you're gonna have to just humor me and let me run through a few.
Sure,
So,
go
you know,
for
I
it.
was raised and wanted to become a filmmaker because of Lawrence of Arabia. I grew up in Saudi Arabia, and I love David Lean. Vertigo as well for me is incredible. Amadeus, Rosemary's Baby, The Shining, Stalker. The less obvious ones that I must mention are Cure by Kiyoshi Kurosawa, which is a fantastic psychological horror film. Possession by Andrzej Żuławski. I don't know if you've seen that one, 1981, Isabella Gianni, Sam Neill. Brilliant film. And then Decalogue 1, which is Kieślowski's, another Polish director, his first installment of the Decalogue based on the First Commandment. A fantastic film that holds up. But my top 3 for this podcast have to be Don't Look Now by Nick Rogue, 1973. The editing in that film is fantastic. It's called sort of associative editing, where people, where the editor and the director, they cut on color or action, and it creates this very, very strange tapestry that has come closest for me, more than any other film, to replicating what it's like to be human and to have the past and the present and the future in one moment, which seems impossible, but it's something that cinema can do and comes close to being able to achieve in this film. It's a film about grief. It's a film about memory, but also, I don't know if you've seen it, but there's that amazing love scene with Donald Sutherland and Julie Christie that's intercut with them making love and also getting dressed afterwards. It's that kind of stuff, It's all about feeling. It also captures Venice in the winter, which is so rare, but so beautiful with the fog and the mist. It's just perfect. For me, it's a model of what a film could be, psychologically truthful, but a bit elevated and supernatural and weird, with a strong plot and just excellent location. So for me, it's got to be talked about. Come and See is my second choice, by Klimov. It's an anti-war film from 1985. It's incredible, relentless psychological study of a boy in wartime with inventive cinematography. It feels operatic. So that's got to be on that list. It's also personal. My grandmother was exiled to an Arctic work camp from Poland during the war and escaped, and has an incredible story. So maybe it's especially meaningful for me because it feels personal. And the third one is quite controversial. It's a film called Salo, or 120 Days of Sodom by Pasolini. It's his last film. It's adapted from a Marquis de Sade book that was lost for many years and then refound, about 4 libertines who run amok in 18th century France, but Pasolini brilliantly transposes that to fascist Italy at the end of World War II. It's a very difficult watch. If any of your listeners are going to go and seek it out, be careful. It's life-changing, but again, really speaks to what cinema can be and the power of it. It's one of the only films that ever has made me viscerally ill, and I think there's some strength and something we can learn from that. So forgive me for going off a bit, but that's those are my top 3 and then some other small ones.
Perfect. That's exactly what we want to hear. Now, if you could invite any 3 movie characters to your next dinner party, who would they be and why?
Great question. So hard to separate the filmmakers from their protagonists usually. So I'll kind of riff off what I just said. So Pasolini's first film is called Acatone, and there's a character in it called Vittorio, aka Acatone. It's basically a Roman pimp who lives on the outskirts of Rome, played by Franco Citti, who's in The Godfather, classic Italian actor, an amazing guy. I think he's so cheeky, and he's so funny, and he's such a character. I would list others for my favorite films, but most of them are mad or hard to be around. So it's sort of like, this is a very difficult question, but I'd find it fascinating to be around him. The second is a bit of a cheat. I would choose Thomas Jerome Newton, who's Bowie's character from The Man Who Fell to Earth. Predominantly so I can hang out with Bowie, but also just because he's such an interesting creation. He's literally an alien, right? So I'd love to know about him. And then the third one is a little bit geeky, but it's a 1981 film by Jean-Jacques Annaud called Quest for Fire. I don't know if you've seen that one, but it's basically about early humans 80,000 years ago and their quest to control fire. There's a character in it called Nao, who's an early Homo sapien. I would invite him to this party too. And basically, the film was written by Arnaud and Gerard Braque, who's a French writer who wrote a lot of the early Polanski films. There's a language in it that Anthony Burgess invented that's modeled around Indo-European. It's the guy who wrote A Clockwork Orange, another great writer. So I think it would be insane to have this Homo sapien, David Bowie's character from The Man Who Fell to Earth, and then this pimp at my dinner party. And I would invite you, Jonathan. You'd be allowed to
I
go.
would love to be in attendance for that one. Now, do you have any books you could recommend that you've read recently or really enjoy? They can be fiction or nonfiction and don't necessarily have to be related to movies.
They don't necessarily have to be, but they will
But
be.
they can be, yes.
Yeah. So the first is Bresson's Notes on Cinematography. For me, that is like a Bible of cinematic aphorisms. It's from 1975. And they're literally just these like one-liners about how he approaches cinema. Lines like cinematography, a military art, prepare a film like a battle. Or the eyes see, but the ear imagines. You know, just little things that as a filmmaker you can go back to, little proverbs that like realign you with what cinema is and can be. I love it. I go back to it all the time. I think it might be out of print, but I think it's available in PDF form around the internet. I highly recommend filmmakers check it out. The second, probably, I mean, I try to choose one biography. I also recommend that anyone who likes films by a filmmaker seek out their biography because you can learn so much. I did that with Kieślowski, on Kieślowski, Sidney Lumet, who I mentioned already today, with his book Making Movies. Alexander Mackendrick, who's a great teacher. He taught at AFI for a long time, but also was a filmmaker. He wrote a book called On Filmmaking, which is fantastic. All those three books were essential to helping me form my thoughts about filmmaking. But I'm going to choose for my second one, The Magic Lantern by Bergman, just because his life was so interesting. And, you know, his father was a priest, and talks about getting locked into a morgue with a dead body when he was a kid and sitting in a Swedish church with his DP, Sven Nykvist, for a month, just watching the light change, you know, just amazing things. And then the third is a rare track that I heard about through Kubrick. It was his favorite text and maybe the only book he read about film. It's by Pudovkin, the Russian or you know, Soviet filmmaker and writer from the late 1920s. It's called Film Technique and Film Acting. And it's really cool because it's sort of thinking about this new art form, which it was back then, you know, in its nascent phase. And he just talks about very basic things that almost you could take for granted. But I find that looking at it through that lens of that time period really makes you think about what cinema is, what it can do, what it was, theories of montage, or, you know, how a film is built shot by shot, like elementary stuff, but things that he goes into in quite a lot of detail and reacquaints you in terms of, again, what cinema can be, how to tell a story with images and sound. So those are my 3 or 7.
Wonderful. Well, and who else from the world of film should I try and get on the podcast?
Oh, right. I mean, I think everyone from my film, right? I want to
Sure.
do a shout out to Philip and my DP on this one, Arlene Muller, my production designer, Kelly Fallon. We all met at the American Film Institute. They're all doing interesting things. In terms of bigger people, I mean, I don't know. Who do you think had the best film this year? Let me ask you a question.
Oh my goodness.
You could choose one.
Just one. I was, you know, being the Oscar guy, I was rooting for Anora to win at the Oscars, which it did. I
Okay,
thoroughly enjoyed that film.
fair enough.
So I'd love to have any of the cast or Sean Baker on to talk movies.
I quite liked Conclave.
Yep, that was my
Edward
second
Berger's film.
for sure.
I just thought it was so well crafted. I mean, obviously it's adapted from a great story, but I think the way it was done, it's so subtle, you know, and the cinematography and the design, and some of those shots were beautiful. So yeah, I would try to get Edward Berger on as well.
We'll put him on the list, see if we can get a hold of him.
Amazing.
And last thing, before we wrap up here, do you have any other projects lined up? And also, where can people follow you on social media to keep up on your work?
Yes. So my next feature is called The Housemaster. It's about my experience in boarding school in England in the 90s, which sounds as awful as it was. No, not entirely, but it's sort of riffing on, you know, themes of bullying and class and revenge. It's sort of like a Carrie-esque film mixed with Lindsay Anderson's If, which is a boarding school film from the late 60s that was actually Malcolm McDowell's first role that Kubrick saw and cast him in A Clockwork Orange. So that kind of ultra-violent story, but sort of elevated the realms of the supernatural, where a young man arrives as an outcast in a boarding house and allies with a housemaster who's dabbling in the occult. So it's a bit Rosemary's Baby-ish as well. And that's hopefully shooting this winter in the UK. So hopefully sometime next year, if we're lucky, that will be out. And where can people hook up with me? Instagram at Paul J. Kowalski, Kowalski. You could follow me, follow my work, engage with me, write me messages. And then my website, paulkowalski.com. I post stuff on there as it comes through, and that's about the extent of my activity online.
Excellent. Well, we'll be sure to put links to all of that in there so people can find you and see the feature when it comes out. Well, Paul, thank you so much for the time today. Really appreciated you sharing your film with me. Really looking forward to having people watch it and also get to listen to some of your stories about it.
Thanks for having me, Jonathan. I really enjoyed it. Have a good one.
Thank you again to my guest today, Paul Kowalski. His short film Sardinia is now available on the Omeletto YouTube channel. The Oscar Project podcast is written and produced by me, Jonathan Eaterberg, with editing assistance from Joshua Eaterberg. If you want more movie coverage, check out the Oscar Project online at theoscarproject.substack.com, and be sure to come back for my next episode where I will be chatting with John Kelly, director of the short film Retirement Plan. Until then, I hope to see you at the movies.